of Apple AirPods. And finally, £500 to spend at your favourite UK attraction. Fun in the Sun could be on us. For a chance to win the iPhone, treats and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
We're GB News, and we come from a proud tradition of British journalism.
That's why I'm so excited to be here. It's something so new.
The first news channel to be launched in Britain in over 30 years.
Launched to represent the views of the British people.
To go where other broadcasters refuse to go.
How did you find out about the story in the first place?
Launched with one aim.
To be the fearless champion of Britain.
It's an absolutely fantastic atmosphere here.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel. GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, lovely people, fellow travellers. Welcome along to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, on radio and online. Tonight, should primary schools teach pupils about gender identity? Could national service be good for Britain's youngsters? And should we be concerned about the rise of the Asian hornets? All of that and more coming up. But first, an update on the latest news headlines.
Very good evening to you from the newsroom. 6 o'clock exactly, and a look at the headlines tonight. We'll start with a roundup of the election news, as migration has been at the forefront of Labour's campaigning today after accusing the Conservatives of having repeatedly broken their promises. Sir Keir Starmer's promising to bring net migration down if he wins the general election, with new laws, he says, to train British workers and to plug gaps in the jobs market. Speaking to The Sun on Sunday, he said last year's net migration figure of 685,000 has to come down. Well, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper refused to put a time frame or set a specific target on that promise.
Well, net migration has trebled in the last 5 years under the Conservatives. One of the biggest drivers of that has been work migration. We're not setting a target, a specific target on it. And the reason for that is partly because the Conservatives have just effectively ripped up all the targets that they've set over many years. They've discredited the whole process. But also, more importantly, because there are short-term factors that can affect the numbers. And what we think instead is we need to have a long-term approach that is about bringing net migration down and tackling the failings in the system.
Meanwhile, the Conservatives have said they would free up 20 million GP appointments by the end of the next Parliament if they return to power. The party are promising 100 new GP surgeries in England, and they say to modernise 150 others. The party's also pledging to expand the Pharmacy First scheme. The plans would be paid for by cutting the number of NHS managers back to pre-pandemic levels. Health Secretary Victoria Adkins says they are working to make the NHS better.
My job as Health Secretary, for example, is to explain our vision for our NHS, which is to reform it to make it faster, simpler and fairer. And some of the announcements I have today concerning GP surgeries, concerning Pharmacy First and community diagnostic centres are the ways that we will help deliver that over the coming years. We are going to fund this. It's fully funded. We're going to fund it partly through a reduction of managers in the NHS.
And the SNP rather, has launched its election campaign in Glasgow today, accusing Labour and the Conservatives of failing Scotland. First Minister John Swinney told a crowd that people in Scotland want rid of the disastrous and chaotic Conservative government. He also spoke about the independence campaign under the SNP, saying it would allow the country to make its own decisions and enhance the lives of Scottish people.
And it's the people of Scotland that I want to speak to directly today as we set out our message. Let me make this commitment to the people of Scotland. I am here to serve you all. I am here to work hard to win your trust and your confidence. I am here to give everything I have to secure the best future for our country.
In other news, the Met Police has confirmed that 56 people were arrested at Wembley last night at the Champions League final. Thousands of football fans were at the stadium to watch that final match. Police say 5 were arrested for pitch invasion. Dozens of others were arrested for attempting to breach security. Well, the FA has now confirmed that no one who tried to get into the stadium without a ticket was successful. In Israel, there's division over the proposed ceasefire deal to end the war in Gaza. Demonstrations broke out overnight in Tel Aviv, one against the government there and the other calling for the release of hostages. Protesters say they want a deal to be agreed that would see the return of Israelis who were kidnapped by Hamas in October last year. 2 senior right-wing ministers have threatened, though, to quit the government and bring down the coalition if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agrees to that brokered deal by the US. North Korea has launched what's being described as a bizarre barrage of balloons filled with rubbish, cigarettes and suspected animal waste floating towards its southern neighbour. More than 700 balloons have been found so far in various parts of the south, with explosive clearance teams dispatched to recover any debris. The South Korean government are calling it a dirty provocation from the north. However, Pyongyang says it's in retaliation for defectors who often send their own balloons across the border containing leaflets, medicine and USB sticks. And in a historic first, China has successfully landed a spacecraft on the south side, the dark side, of the moon. The unmanned Chang'e 6 lunar probe is exploring a region that no other country has ever managed to reach and is on a mission to collect rocks and soil samples. The European Space Agency says it's a mean feat given there's no line of sight for communication, which makes landing there more challenging. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
You might not have heard of the Ukrainian Azov Brigade. The fighting unit was formed of volunteers in 2014. In the beginning, it was led by Andrei Beletsky, who has said it is Ukraine's national purpose to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against Semite-led Untermensch, end quote. Untermensch means underclass, inferior people. The Azov Brigade is the product of Nazi ideology, and it's no secret. Nazi ideology that was and remains an undeniable problem for Ukraine. As recently as 2018, the United States Congress ordered that none of its aid was to be used to, quote, provide arms, training or other assistance to the Azov Battalion. But last week, pictures circulated of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in what appeared to be a room in a private members' club in London, praising the brigade's members as heroes. This was, let's not forget, the same Boris Johnson who was the NATO bag carrier sent in 2022 to scupper the potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, thereby helping consign uncounted tens of thousands to the meat grinder since then. Johnson posed with the brigade's flag, told his guests and his audience, "My message to you is very simple. Thank you to the heroes from the Azov Brigade who honour us with their presence tonight." He took the opportunity to demand on behalf of Ukraine the right to fire Western-made weapons deep into Russian territory, a move that threatens the final descent into World War III, which is a hot war with Russia. In the upended, upside-down world in which we are living, it can be hard to remember what we were once invited to know as the truth. For example, I'm sure I remember at school being taught that the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and more besides, won the Second World War by defeating a bunch calling themselves Nazis. I was also definitely taught that Britain went to war with Nazi Germany with the intention of restoring freedom and democracy to those who had been denied them by the Nazis, and that by 1945 this objective had been achieved specifically by defeating those Nazis. Of course, even a cursory examination of the events that unfolded during World War II reveals it was all, to be fair, a bit more nuanced than that, to put it mildly. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the stated intention had been about restoring freedom and democracy, specifically to Poland and the Poles who had been invaded by Nazis. When I say the playing out of events was nuanced, I mean, for example, that you don't have to be much of a student of history to notice that when the war ended, Poland and the Poles were completely abandoned to be eaten alive by the Soviet. No freedom restored for them, nor democracy either. But that's international diplomacy and geopolitics for you, or to put it another way, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. All of that said, I'm still sure I remember being taught that the Allies won the Second World War and that those nasty Nazis, the enemy of all that is good, were definitely defeated by us. The Nazis, I was taught, were the baddest baddies of World War II. The very sight of their famous logo, being the swastika, was supposed to strike terror into freedom-loving hearts forever, its meaning never to be forgotten. There were other insignia besides, all beyond the pale. Never again, I'm sure I remember that slogan as well, and being urged to make all efforts to ensure nothing like Nazism and its attendant horrors could ever return to stalk the planet. Ukrainians suffered horrors in the 20th century, before, during and after World War II, that are almost unimaginable. Under Stalin, they knew the Great Ukrainian Famine, also called the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933, which killed perhaps 5 million people. Under Nazi occupation during the war, there was more suffering. More than 1 million were murdered as part of the Holocaust. Jews, gypsies, political opponents, any and all deemed undesirable. Untermenschen. At Baba Yar, a ravine near the capital city of Kiev, tens of thousands of men, women and children were ordered to strip naked before being herded into mass graves and machine-gunned to death. Some Ukrainians sided with Nazis, others sided with Russians. And then the second half of the 20th century happened, right up to and including the decades since 1989, when NATO ignored all of Russia's red lines until it was 1,000 miles closer to the bear. Then a US-enabled coup in 2014, the chasing out of Kiev of a democratically elected president disliked by Washington and favoured by Moscow. A Ukrainian civil war in which those with affiliation to Russia were the targets of sectarian violence. Estimates of 10,000 dead in the last decade in the east of Ukraine, killed by explosives dropped on them by those in the west of that country. Always the push to pull Ukraine, Russia's stated buffer against NATO, into NATO and even the European Union. And then in September last year, I watched in real life, in real time, a Ukrainian Nazi veteran of that war, of World War II, being treated to a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament, while Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau grinned and clapped along with every other parliamentarian in the room, and while President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine raised a clenched fist in salute, 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka was bathed in the adoration of all assembled. Hunka had been introduced to the throng as a Canadian war hero who had, and here's where the world turned upside down, fought the Russians during World War II. Remember, in so much as history matters, the Russians during some of the 1940s at least were our allies. Old man Hunka, as it turned out, had been a member of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, or the SS 14th Waffen Division, a Ukrainian volunteer unit under the command of those that slaughtered the tens or the hundreds of thousands at Baba Yar. Those I had been taught to understand as the baddies, those Nazis. The Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Centre for Holocaust Studies said that Hunka's division, quote, was responsible for the mass murder of civilians with a level of brutality and malice that is unimaginable, close quote. So, as I said, an upside-down world, a world in which the truth is turned on its head or turned inside out or otherwise perverted. In recent years, statues have been raised in Ukraine and in Canada, as it happens, to which many Nazis fled after the war, to honour some of those Ukrainians who, during that war, served the Nazi regime. Some Ukrainian streets are named for Nazi proxies too. To this day, Ukraine, and therefore the Ukrainian army, has an undeniable Nazi problem, the Azov Brigade, now part of the Ukraine National Guard, being part of it. And so I ask myself, exactly where are we with Nazis? Did fathers and grandfathers of ours fight and die to defeat Nazis or not? While we're at it, let's not forget Operation Paperclip, when at the end of the war the United States decided there were Nazi scientists and intellectuals in Germany in possession of knowledge and skills that outweighed, as far as the US administration was concerned, any crimes they may have committed. By this means did an unknown number of Nazi scientists and thinkers enter the US, placed quietly into academia, research institutions and into every other walk of American life, so that a lifetime later a person might justifiably ask, was World War II, in which the fathers and grandfathers died, really about defeating Nazis and Nazism at all? Before Hitler and his Nazis finally became too toxic even for them, all manner of the British elite were enthusiastic supporters of his particular brand of fascism. The elite has a guiding mission, after all. It's about purity of blood and preserving lineages, which just happens to have been the defining obsession of Adolf Hitler and his Aryans. A handful born to rule and billions of pesky, unwanted Untermensch cluttering up the joint, consuming resources and otherwise spoiling the view. Only the most famous or infamous is Oswald Mosley, 6th Baronet, leader of the British Union of Fascists, with a family line all the way back to the 12th century. His first wedding to Lady Cynthia Curzon in 1920 was attended by the King and Queen. His second wife was Lady Diana Mitford, daughter of another baron and dedicated fascist. Diana's sister was Unity Valkyrie Mitford, who joined the British delegation at the Nuremberg Rally in 1933 and was described by those that knew her as, quote, more Nazi than the Nazis. Lift the carpet, listen beyond the rhetoric, and hardly a staple of the British establishment is found clean of the fingerprints of fascism. From the 16th century plantation of Ireland to the slavery and segregation of the American colonies and onwards to opposition to universal suffrage and the rest of troublesome democracy, the self-proclaimed elites have always fought to keep the lower orders, which is all of us, firmly under their boot heels. The theft of the very land itself by means of enclosure from the 13th century onwards meant that by the time of the First World War, 4/5 of the UK was in the possession of the aristocracy. Bill Gates and his greedy acquisition of more than 250,000 acres of US farmland and the World Economic Forum-driven grab for the farmland of Europe is just the latest iteration of the same old determination to rip the good stuff from the hands of the many and to centralise it in the grip of the very, very few. Millions like me were raised to believe the Allies fought the Nazis and won. The people like you and me, acted in good faith and then kept the faith. Never again we learned to cry. Never again. But I watched the footage of Johnson in London and I wondered just what really happened. Who won, who lost? What have we really learned? What are we supposed to think of the agonies of the 20th century? What were they suffered for? Here's the thing. There can be no doubt that the people of Britain, like other peoples around the West and the world, were told their forebears fought and died to defeat Nazism and Nazis. How are we, the people of this country, of the West, even to know which way is up? If an organisation in direct line of descent from Nazis is being celebrated in London within living memory of the days when Johnson's hero, Winston Churchill, railed against Nazism, just who are the good guys? And just who were the bad guys? Let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, author, writer and broadcaster. Stuart Crawford, what is your assessment of that footage of Boris Johnson in those circumstances?
The Azov Brigade, as it now is, has undeniably neo-Nazi and Nazi affiliations in the past. It was, as you probably know, raised as a sort of militia in the Donetsk Oblast to resist the illegal Russian invasion back in 2014. And of course, they were unsuccessful in resisting the Russian invasion. But I think it was in 2017, the Azov Brigade was incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine. So it became part of mainstream Ukrainian armed forces. And since then, there have been considerable efforts to distance itself from its origins. And of course, the one incident, or the one event in which they played a major part was the siege of Mariupol, where they retreated into the steelworks and kept the Russians out for a considerable period of time against, it has to be said, overwhelming odds before the Ukrainian government told them to surrender. So I think that we have to place it in the context of how that organization has developed. I'm not making any pleas for them. I'm not carrying a flag for them, no pun intended. But I think that the affiliations with neo-Nazism and Nazism are in the past. And certainly, of course, Boris Johnson is not a neo-Nazi, nor would he support any organisation which had such ideology.
I'll leave that there for the moment, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, but you'll be joining us later in the show, you know, where we can get into a lengthier conversation on this topic. Thank you very much for your contribution so far, though. Joining me this evening is broadcaster, author and TV personality and chum, Ingrid Tarrant. Hello, Ingrid.
Hello, Neil.
This is an extension for me, really, of the topsy-turvy, upside-down nature of the world. You know, where men are really women and the countryside is racist.
Well, they don't know what they are.
And all of Britain's history and heritage is just shameful and all of the rest of it. Do you not feel that you no longer know what are supposed to be the things you can hold on to and count on?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do know, as you said, like you were taught and you were grown up to believe this and, you know, never again and so on. But it just seems that the next generation, and we are subject to it as well, are being taught a very different story. So it's terribly confusing. And you have to stay strong, don't you, and focused to remember what really the true story is without them trying to confuse us. That's what it is, because once confused, you know, we're easy fodder. Our minds are being taken over. And it's true, Russia was our ally in the Second World War, and that's what they agreed to do because they wanted to prevent Nazism from winning as well. And it was very clear, but it's only to do that, and then we'll go back to how we stood before. But they have broken every agreement. They have just got closer to the border, and now they're on their borders.
Why? I don't understand. Amongst the long list of things I don't understand, wasn't it, in 1989, 1990, there's 1,000 miles between NATO and Russia.
Now there's nothing.
Now, why wouldn't you want, you know, if Russia was the big bad threat, isn't 1,000 miles of distance really worth maintaining?
Yeah, you would think.
In that context, motivated, no, let's get right up to where we can look each other into the whites of our eyes.
Yes, I know.
That's aggressive.
Yeah, that is totally aggressive and that's provocative. But also, let's not forget that they've got their nuclear plants there. That's the Western world, that's America, and it's the breadbasket of the world. So they are actually, they have something to offer. If there wasn't that, and of course we've got the pipeline going through, that's another strange thing. You know, Putin could have just turned off the tap. They didn't need to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 and then blame Oh, do you know, we're going really down a rabbit hole here, aren't we? But I get so angry about the way that this is packaged.
It's an interesting rabbit hole, but we've got a break upon us already, Ingrid, after which should primary schools be teaching pupils about gender identity? You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
How prevalent is it in those with darker skin, like me?
That's a great question, and it's one that we get a lot. So your skin tone does affect your risk of skin cancer. People at the most risk are people with lighter skin tones, so light-coloured hair and eyes as well, lots of moles and freckles, a history of sunburn or a family history of skin cancer. But people with darker skin tones can still burn and can still get skin cancer. Anybody can get skin cancer. So I would encourage everybody, regardless of your ethnicity or your skin tone, to think really seriously about taking care when it's sunny. That myth that you've mentioned that Black people can't get skin cancer is really prevalent, and that's something I want to dispel right now, immediately, because more Black people think maybe they can't get skin cancer. That might mean that when they spot something unusual for them, they're less likely to go to the doctor and they're diagnosed later. And when you're diagnosed later, your outcomes do tend to be worse.
So the figures are disturbing that more people are getting skin cancer. But what about outcomes? I mean, if you do get skin cancer, what are your prospects?
So yeah, like you say, this research is a mixed picture. We're seeing incidence, so the number of new cases going up, which is not good news. But there is some good news in that mortality, so whether you're going to die or not, is actually going down. And we think that's partly due to early diagnosis, which I just mentioned is so important. But also research has led to better and kinder treatments, which mean the outcomes are likely to be better. So now, if you're diagnosed at the earliest stage, stage 1, with melanoma, actually around 9 in 10 people will survive their disease for 5 years or more.
The People's Channel.
In the GB newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. The government have recently released new guidelines restricting the teaching of relationships, sex and health education, or RSHE as it's known, in primary schools. Related to that, a new YouGov survey in the aftermath of that announcement revealed that most Britons say that schools should teach about different gender identities. The purple on that graph indicates those in favour, the red, those who are not. Basic facts of conception and birth saw 93% in favour. Teaching about pornography, 72% in favour, and that people can be non-binary as a gender other than male or female, 60% in favour. OK, I'm joined now by Dr Anna Lutfi, Equality and Human Rights Barrister. Anna, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Just a quick reaction, first of all, to that finding in that YouGov poll, however much weight you put on a YouGov poll.
Well, the poll seems to suggest that a majority of Britons want these things to be taught or discussed. And, of course, we live in a world where these issues are raging around us, and, of course, they should be discussed. But whether they should be discussed in a way that is one-sided or partisan is another question. And I would also like to know what most what most Britons think gender identity is, because I don't think anyone knows.
It's such a contentious issue that inspires such passions here, there and everywhere. You've been involved in challenging this ideology and the way that this ideology is prosecuted, I suppose. Where are we at the moment, and how much does it matter that these new guidelines have been issued by the government?
Well, you touch on something that's quite complicated and difficult to distill into a short time frame, but you've hit the nail on the head when you talk about guidelines being issued and then fresh guidelines being issued, because that is indeed where we are at the moment. We were told in 2020 that schools have to teach something called gender identity. They were told they had to teach the law and the facts about gender identity as part of the RSE mandate. But of course, as I just said, gender identity is a meaningless term in law and in fact. And therefore, it is a big question mark as to what the government meant when it said, as part of LGBT content integrated through curricula everywhere in the country, schools should teach gender identity legally and factually. And this point was made quite clear in subsequent reactions to the mandated RSE guidance, which means that the government has been basically put under pressure to define gender identity. It cannot, nor can any man or woman standing, or any non-binary person for that matter. So what's happened is there's been a revision of the position of the government such that draft guidance was published in December 2023, making clear that gender identity is an ideology and that it is heavily contested as a belief system. So rather than having to teach gender identity as in terms of the law and the facts, which is impossible, the latest draft guidance, which was open for consultation and remains draft, indicates a government shift whereby they have acknowledged that gender identity is an ideological belief system. Well, if it's an ideological belief system, then other laws must surely kick in, because we do have prohibitions on the promotion of any political ideology in schools if it's not being taught as something which can be discussed and which can be challenged, and which is indeed challenged by many, many people in the country, notwithstanding the YouGov poll.
What have primary school children being taught? What is the nature of the content? How are schools confronting this ideology?
Well, we've seen it's because of the Equality Act, which includes a protected characteristic called gender reassignment. That protected characteristic of gender reassignment is grounds on which you cannot discriminate against a person, like race, like sex, like age, disability. These protected characteristics are the cornerstones of discrimination or anti-discrimination law. And schools have been told in various documents and communications that they have to, because of the public sector equality duty in the Equality Act, they have to make their schools diverse and inclusive places where nobody suffers discrimination or bullying or harassment on the grounds of protected characteristics. Because gender reassignment is in there, that has given carte blanche to schools and other actors operating within schools to, what I would say, promote the idea of gender identity as an inclusive framework which has to be taught to children. However, gender reassignment, technically, if you look at the Equality Act, it really is about a formal process of assigning your sex from one to the other. And if we look at the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, that is clearly a legal formal process that applies to persons of 18 or over. So because the Equality Act is silent on the question of age, and it's also silent on the nature of gender reassignment as a process, that has again given carte blanche to what I would say bad faith actors to promote gender identity in schools as something that you can self-declare at any age without any negative consequences, and ultimately that has resulted in lots of children questioning their gender and becoming disassociated from their biological sex.
As you say, there are already laws protecting and dealing with all of this, why is the government laying out guidelines? Why doesn't it just follow the law?
Well, The Equality Act 2010, which is the legislation I just mentioned, is absent on so many crucial questions when it comes to whether a child as young as 5 can be a transsexual upon self-declaring, that I would say the Equality Act 2010 on this issue is not fit for purpose. So you would imagine that that would be the first priority of a government that cared about this issue. It wouldn't be in the form of draft guidance, non-statutory guidance, draft or otherwise, or statutory guidance. And what we've seen over the last few years is the issuing of various forms of guidance, gender questioning children guidance, relationships and sex education guidance, draft guidance, open for public consultation, statutory guidance, which schools are obliged to follow as far as is reasonably practicable. And as you say, these are legal questions. What needs to be clarified as a matter of law is where the Equality Act sits when it comes to persons under the age of 18 who are starting to express a dissatisfaction with their biological sex, which is a highly concerning development in any child, particularly if the child has a history of being bullied or has autism or it has mental health issues of any other kind.
Ingrid, we were talking at the top of the show about the upside down, not knowing which way is up feeling that we're immersed in at the moment. How do you react to listening to what Anna's saying about this predicament in which primary school kids are finding themselves?
I know, but it is so confusing. As you say, the law says one thing, but it's kind of contradicted somewhere else. It's completely wishy-washy and unclear. But could then... And the 18 is kind of seems to be the key age. So could there not be an introduction of a law? Because this is really a contentious issue, and it's a lot of parents are suffering as a result of it. Their children go into school, and then they come out sort of saying, I now identify as a so-and-so. They've had no part of it, but they've been groomed. I would put it down to almost grooming in school because it's so acceptable and so allowed. But could there not be a protection for children just in this particular subject? So up to the age of 18, they are not taught it. I was thinking about this. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot and deep and hard, but particularly today as it was a topic. And I was on my way of thinking, if there was a Chinese child in a class, does that mean that everybody has got to learn Chinese to be inclusive and accept that? Because to me, I know it sounds an absurd sort of example, but it kind of is as ridiculous in my mind. So.
And grooming, that's a very emotive word that Ingrid quite rightly raises there. Are children being nudged rather than informed?
I mentioned the Equality Act and I said it wasn't really fit for purpose on this issue, and I maintain that position. I think it's shared by many, many people, including many parents and teachers. But there is another piece of legislation that no one ever mentions, and it's never discussed, and I don't really know why it wouldn't have been given the spotlight when it comes to this issue. And it relates to your point about grooming. The Education Act 1996 prohibits, and that's sections 406 and 407, prohibits the promotion of political ideas, which means, putting political ideas to children which are highly contested and divisive, as if there was only one position and there's no debate and there's no contestation. That is political indoctrination. It is prohibited at law. The grooming part of this equation, which you mentioned, has many parents talk about grooming of their children, and many parents talk about indoctrination of their children in schools. The reason they do that is because there are so many actors coming into schools who are not really known entities. We don't really know much about them. We don't know their qualifications or expertise, but they've been allowed to come in carte blanche into schools to teach RSE as consultants and experts, largely because the current status quo legally is so unclear and there are so many loopholes that many schools feel completely at sea when teaching LGBT content as part of their mandate. So they ask these consultants to come in, and these consultants are using the opportunity to push and celebrate and affirm trans identity as if it had no safeguarding concerns whatsoever, and as if it wasn't a politically contested issue, which it is.
Only because of shortage of time, I'm going to have to bring that to an end at the moment. It's such an important conversation. Anna Lutfi, thank you so much, and it's a conversation that I would insist, if you're willing, that we pick up at another time.
You know where I am, Neil. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now it's a break, after which, could national service be good for Britain's youngsters?
Hello and welcome to your GB News weather update brought to you by the Met Office. Well, we've seen plenty of fine weather over the weekend. However, this week is going to be turning more unsettled and a little bit cooler. For today, though, we have had high pressure dominating the weather over the UK, but we have had this frontal system move into the northwest and a slight squeeze in those isobars too, so turning damp and rather windy. It is gradually going to be clouding over from the north through into this evening, staying clearest for longest across the south. And we will start to see some outbreaks of rain and drizzle continue to move their way into northwestern areas. So turning a little bit cooler under the clear spells in the south, but for most, a rather mild night and most places not dropping below double digits. So to start on Monday, there will be a little bit of brightness in the south, but as I say, we'll gradually cloud over through the course of the morning, staying largely dry though. However, we will start to see some rain and drizzle move its way into northwestern England, northern parts of Wales, and quite a cloudy picture across Northern Ireland and northwest Scotland, still with that rain and drizzle, but brightening up through the morning across parts of Aberdeenshire, and there will be some sunny spells across the Northern Isles, but plenty of showers in between those spells of sunshine. Overall on Monday, it is going to be a rather cloudy picture, still with those spots of rain and drizzle in the northwest. By the time we reach the afternoon, it may brighten up a little bit across central and southern UK, but most of the sunshine is going to be across Scotland. However, quite a blustery day on offer there, so that will just take the edge off the temperatures a little bit. But in those sheltered spots where you catch the sunshine, it should still be feeling warm. Now, as we head into Tuesday, we are going to see a bit of a change. Further rain moving in from the northwest, quite blustery and plenty of showers behind too. However, it will still be staying dry across the south and southeast and still feeling warm where you do catch any sunnier spells, but cooler across Scotland, particularly in that wind. And as we head into next week, fairly unsettled, largely dry in the south, but it is going to be feeling largely cool.
GB News is Britain's election channel.
And when the big stories break, we're tackling them on Britain's newsroom. When we disagree, and we disagree a lot, it's even livelier than normal.
We don't disagree that much.
We do.
His comedy, though, is revolting. I knew her, unlike you.
That explains Beverly Turner's temperament.
It's a bit frosty in here, isn't it?
He'll have one of me one day.
For dartball practice.
Britain's newsroom on GB News. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
This is GB News, and we are Britain's election channel.
This vote may seem to be about the politicians in the media, but it's actually about you.
And we won't ever forget that.
Join us up and down the country as we follow every moment together.
Now more than ever, it's important to hear
all sides as you make your decision ahead of polling day.
We're here for you. This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, last weekend, Rishi Sunak announced that he would reintroduce national service in the United Kingdom. Labour, though, said the policy was ill thought through. The proposed scheme would see youngsters required to choose between a year-long military placement or having to take part in community volunteering one weekend every month for a year. Interesting to say the least. I'm joined now by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, defence analyst, author, writer and broadcaster. Thank you for joining me this evening. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Neil.
For or against, Stuart, what do you say?
Oh, I'm hedging my bets here. I'm neither for or against, but I do see that the scheme may have some merit if we examine it in more detail. And of course, the problem is that we don't have detail because it's been very wishy-washy in its presentation. And the promise of the Royal Commission to look into how exactly it might work is one thing, but then again, the Conservative government may not be in power to set up that Royal Commission. So it's all a bit hypothetical. Having said that, I think a fundamental mistake has been made presentationally, calling it national service, because immediately a sort of unholy combination of lefty politicians and Bufton Tuftons in the leather armchairs in various London clubs are up in arms about it, because it's, compulsory military service is not popular, either with the left or the right, funnily enough. But I think if we had called it public service and saw the military side as only part of a much bigger picture, then it's worth further exploration.
My contention, though, is national service, public service, however you want to describe it, is a positive where you can be confident in the motives of the governing group. I do not have confidence in the integrity of the governing group. I point you, for example, to the notion that, were you to have a Union Jack flag flying in your garden in this country at the moment, I think you could expect a knock on the door and questions being asked by the police about hate crime. Children are taught to see the history of the country, the heritage of the country, the British Empire and the rest of it as shameful. Look at the way in which our veterans of the serving armed forces are abandoned on the streets. This is not a benevolent establishment, I would say, and I would further contend, possibly, you feel free to challenge me, that this is the on-ramp to what could eventually be conscription or a draft into the depleted services.
Well, I take all the points that you made. I think that we do live in strange times where flying a flag, whether it be the Union flag or the Saltire or any other flag, can result in a visit from PC Plod. Plus the fact that there's no doubt that the schools are feeding children with a left-orientated agenda, which is damaging, I think, in my opinion. But national conscription is something that has only been invoked in the UK in times of absolute national crisis. The First World War in 1916, when we ran out of manpower on the Western Front, for obvious reasons, and in the Second World War, when I think the whole existence of the UK was at stake. Apart from that, and apart from the sort of drawing down of it during the Cold War, if you like, between 49 and 62, it's not part of our military heritage. And it's something that the military does not really want, except in time of national crisis. And it's easy to sit and talk about it in the abstract, as I was saying to my children just the other day. But if you've got to talk about it when cruise missiles are coming in and hitting Glasgow, Birmingham, in London, then it's a completely different thing altogether.
Bear with me, Stuart. Bear with me just now. Ingrid Tarrant in the studio with me. What say you? I have deep concerns about the kind of, quite frankly, questionable establishment that we have at the moment, taking that kind of authority over our children. When there's already been rattlings about the formation of a citizen army and all sorts of renewed and escalated commitment to the land war in Ukraine, exactly what are we opening the door to here by considering this?
Are you saying really a blanket no then yourself because of, in light of the current situation?
National service, public service, that's a conversation for another day, but not when we've got an establishment and an ideology that is committed to things that are not about the nation, they're not about defence, and they are being set in the context where our children are not educated by the establishment to be proud of any nation.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a massive problem in that respect because there is no national pride. Going back to the signing up conscription, whatever you like to call it, I am very much in favour of that for very, very many reasons. But for people now to go into it, we're completely ill-equipped. And it would be cannon fodder. And, another thing is, this isn't our war. If you asked people and did a poll, nobody would want this. We would go on peace marches, actually like they're doing in Bulgaria this weekend. They're going to have millions. But it is a tricky question, but we'll go back to Stuart and then I'll talk to you about other things where I think there's goodness in it.
Stuart, would you hand on heart be confident that this kind of manoeuvring does not lead to some kind of military service to meet the needs of objectives that are not to do with the defence of this country, but to do with prosecuting what have come to be called the forever wars elsewhere?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would like to think that it wouldn't, put it that way, because, as I said previously, national conscription is only really necessary when we're looking at national survival. Having said that, and bearing in mind that the military part of what Rishi Sunak has proposed, and I'm not a Conservative supporter, as you may well know, is only a small part of a bigger picture. And I think that bigger picture is one where we need to look at what I would call resilience. And I don't mean just military resilience, but I mean resilience in terms of weather events, health events, and so on and so forth. And for the past few decades, we've existed in a sort of supermarket, just-in-time model of supply. And that recently has been found wanting across a whole spectrum of different things. And so we need to have some, if you like, redundancy in the system or some reserves in the system so that we can face future onslaughts should they come to pass.
I'll leave that there just now. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, thank you for your contribution this evening. Another such an important conversation. Ingrid, I've got another break.
Oh, already?
After which, should we be concerned about Asian hornets? Don't go anywhere.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Joint CEO at the UK Sepsis Trust, Dr. Ron Daniels. Very good to see you this morning. Why is it with sepsis we sort of hear very little about it in day-to-day life until there's either a big story or a big tragedy? Why is that? Is it common?
Well, it's astonishing, isn't it? We have a condition here that affects nearly 250,000 people across the UK each year and claims 48,000 lives. And just for context, breast cancer, and I'm not diminishing how horrible that can be, claims 11,000 lives. So sepsis is 4 times more prolific as a killer. I think the reason we don't hear about it is because it doesn't really belong to any particular speciality of doctors. It touches every aspect of healthcare, and therefore there's no professional group to be championing it, which means it needs an advocacy organisation like ours.
My understanding is that it's when your own immune system starts to attack the tissues, but by the time people realise that their temperature isn't just flu or something, they can often be in quite a perilous state.
It arises in people of any age, people with whether or not they've got underlying illness, and it can arise as a consequence of any infection. So it presents hugely differently.
So what do we do?
If you're concerned something is devastatingly wrong, there are 6 key symptoms to look for, and they spell the word sepsis. S for slurred speech or confusion. E for extreme pain in the muscles or joints. P for passing no urine, no water in a day. S for severe breathlessness. I for it feels like I'm going to die, and people really do say that. And then the final S for skin that's mottled or discoloured or very pale. Any one of those 6 in the context of infection, it goes straight to A&E.
The People's Channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country.
That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show for the sting in the tail. Ha-ha. The Asian hornet poses a significant threat, we are told, to the UK's wildlife, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds have urged the public to report any sightings to the relevant authorities. People are being urged to report sightings of Asian hornets this summer as nature groups warn of a potential surge in damaging, invasive, non-native species. I'm joined now by social media manager at the British Beekeepers Association, Ian Campbell. Good evening, Ian Campbell. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Good evening.
Where have these insects come from? How have they got here?
They first arrived in France, southwest France, about 20 years ago. It's believed from China, and they've spread through France and a lot of countries. About 14 countries in Europe have had sightings now, and last year we started to see significant incursions into the UK.
What size of a creature are we talking about here? You know, if it was on the palm of your hand, heaven forfend.
Overall, they're a big insect. I mean, sort of getting on for twice the size of a bee or a wasp. They're about 25 millimetres long is the average size of an adult. The queens and the males later in the year are a little bit bigger. They're slightly smaller than the European hornet, which is native to this country, which we're not worried about.
What kind of wildlife do they threaten? And by extension, I suppose I'd have to say, do they pose a threat to you and me?
To an extent, there is a public health risk, yes, to humans. They can get into, I mean, in France, there's about 500,000 estimated nests around. Especially outdoor agricultural workers can be at risk. The number of serious injuries and deaths is relatively low, but they do defend their nests very vigorously, and if you get too close to a nest, you can be in trouble.
As a beekeeper, you know, you're representing the Beekeepers Association. We hear so much about the threats and the pressure that the bee population is under all the time. Does this just pile more pressure on the God-blessed bee?
It certainly does, yeah. I mean, there's about 250 species of bee in the UK. Asian hornets tend to, we're now increasingly calling them yellow-legged Asian hornets because it's a bit more descriptive and it separates them out from some other species that aren't in the UK. But these species, this Asian hornet, it is, if it gets near a honeybee nest or a hive, it will hawk outside and it will pick off bees. They like social insects like bees and wasps. They will also take flies and spiders, but social insects live in big colonies and it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for them, and they will predate very heavily on them.
Ian, thanks so much. It's a worrisome development, I'm sure, for many people for all sorts of reasons. Thank you so much for casting a bright light of attention onto the presence among us of Asian hornets. Thank you. Thank you for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you, Ingrid, for being with me so far. You can catch the second hour with extended interviews, though, over on gbnews.com now. You know it makes sense.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello and welcome to your GB News weather update brought to you by the Met Office. Well, we've seen plenty of fine weather over the weekend. However, this week is going to be turning more unsettled and a little bit cooler. For today, though, we have had high pressure dominating the weather over the UK, but we have had this frontal system move into the northwest and a slight squeeze in those isobars too, so turning damp and rather windy. It is gradually going to be clouding over from the north through into this evening, staying clearest for longest across the south. And we will start to see some outbreaks of rain and drizzle continue to move their way into northwestern areas. So turning a little bit cooler under the clear spells in the south, but for most, a rather mild night and most places not dropping below double digits. So to start on Monday, there will be a little bit of brightness in the south, but as I say, we'll gradually cloud over through the course of the morning, staying largely dry though. However, we will start to see some rain and drizzle move its way into northwestern England, northern parts of Wales, and quite a cloudy picture across Northern Ireland and northwest Scotland, still with that rain and drizzle, but brightening up through the morning across parts of Aberdeenshire, and there will be some sunny spells across the Northern Isles, but plenty of showers in between those spells of sunshine. Overall on Monday, it is going to be a rather cloudy picture, still with those spots of rain and drizzle in the northwest. By the time we reach the afternoon, it may brighten up a little bit across central and southern UK, but most of the sunshine is going to be across Scotland. However, quite a blustery day on offer there, so that will just take the edge off the temperatures a little bit. But in those sheltered spots where you catch the sunshine, it should still be feeling warm. Now, as we head into Tuesday, we are going to see a bit of a change. Further rain moving in from the northwest, quite blustery, and plenty of showers behind too. However, it will still be staying dry across the south and southeast and still feeling warm where you do catch any sunnier spells, but cooler across Scotland, particularly in that wind. And as we head into next week, fairly unsettled, largely dry in the south, but it is going to be feeling largely cool.
That warm feeling inside.
It's the Great British Summer Giveaway, and have we got a prize for you? There's a totally tax-free £15,000 in cash to make your summer spectacular. Spend that extra cash however you like. You'll also win a brand new iPhone, Apple AirPods, and if that wasn't enough, a £500 voucher to spend at your favourite UK attraction, so you can enjoy amazing days out this year. For a chance to win the iPhone, treats, and £15,000 cash, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB06 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of June. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Ellie Costello, and thank you so much for joining us here on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me.
My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country.
That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Very good evening to you. You're watching and listening to GB News. It's 7 o'clock and the top stories from the newsroom. First, we'll bring you some breaking news tonight. From the sporting world, we've heard that rugby league legend Rob Burrow has died at the age of 41. He was diagnosed with motor neurone disease in December 2019 and was awarded a CBE last year for his fundraising work to raise awareness for the MND condition. It came just 2 years after he retired from playing in the rugby league following a 17-year career, including 8 grand final wins, 3 World Club challenges and 2 Challenge Cups. Well, he spent his entire career playing for Leeds Rhinos, who announced that news tonight, saying he was an inspiration for the entire country. Rob Burrow, who has died at the age of 41. Well, in some other breaking political news tonight, Diane Abbott has confirmed that she does intend to run as a candidate for the Labour Party in July's general election. And that comes after speculation that she may have been choosing to stand down. The veteran MP's taken to social media tonight to say that she is the adopted Labour candidate for the seat that she has held since 1987. It comes after Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said that Miss Abbott was free to go forward as a Labour candidate, ending days of speculation about her future. And staying with Labour, migration has been at the forefront of their election campaigning today after accusing the Conservatives of having repeatedly broken their promises. Sir Keir Starmer's promising to bring net migration down if he wins the general election, with new laws to train British workers and to plug gaps in the jobs market. Speaking to The Sun on Sunday, he said last year's net migration figure of 685,000, he says, has to come down, while Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper refused to put a time frame on that promise or to set any specific targets.
Well, net migration has trebled in the last 5 years under the Conservatives. One of the biggest drivers of that has been work migration. We're not setting a target, a specific target on it. And the reason for that is partly because the Conservatives have just effectively ripped up all the targets that they've set over many years. They've discredited the whole process. But also, more importantly, because there are short-term factors that can affect the numbers. And what we think instead is we need to have a long-term approach that is about bringing net migration down and tackling the failings in the system.
Meanwhile, the Conservatives say that they would free up 20 million GP appointments by the end of the next Parliament. That's if they return to power. They're promising 100 new GP surgeries across England and to modernise 150 others. They're also pledging to expand their Pharmacy First scheme. Those plans, they say, would be paid for by cutting the number of NHS managers to pre-pandemic levels. Health Secretary Victoria Adkins says they are working to make the NHS better.
My job as Health Secretary, for example, is to explain our vision for our NHS, which is to reform it to make it faster, simpler and fairer. And some of the announcements I have today concerning GP surgeries, concerning Pharmacy First and community diagnostic centres are the ways that we will help deliver that over the coming years. We are going to fund this. It's fully funded. We're going to fund it partly through a reduction of managers in the NHS.
And also out on the campaign trail today, the SNP launched their election campaign pledge in Glasgow, accusing Labour and the Conservatives of failing Scotland. First Minister John Swinney told a crowd people in Scotland want rid of what he called disastrous, chaotic Conservative government. He also spoke about independence under the SNP, saying it would allow the country to make its own decisions and to enhance the lives of Scottish people.
And it's the people of Scotland that I want to speak to directly today as we set out our message. Let me make this commitment to the people of Scotland. I am here to serve you all. I am here to work hard to win your trust and your confidence. I am here to give everything I have to secure the best future for our country.
Well, turning away from election news to London, where the Metropolitan Police have confirmed 56 people were arrested in Wembley last night at the Champions League final. Thousands of football fans were at the Met Stadium to watch Real Madrid beat Borussia Dortmund. Police say 5 people were arrested for pitch invasion, dozens of others for attempting to breach security. Well, the FA has now confirmed that no one who tried to get into the stadium without a ticket was successful. North Korea has launched what's being described as a bizarre barrage of balloons filled with rubbish, cigarette butts and suspected animal poo floating towards its southern neighbour. More than 700 balloons have been found in various parts of South Korea so far, with chemical and explosive clearance teams dispatched to recover any debris. The South Korean government's calling it a dirty provocation from the north. However, Pyongyang says it's in retaliation for defectors and activists who often send their own inflatables across the border. They contain leaflets, food, medicine and USB sticks. And finally, media mogul Rupert Murdoch has married again for the 5th time at the age of 93, tying the knot with retired Russian molecular biologist Alina Zhukova at his California vineyard. Wedding photos you can see here if you're watching on television show Mr. Murdoch in a black suit with a yellow tie. He's beaming alongside his new 67-year-old wife. It comes after his brief engagement to Anne Leslie Smith, which ended just a year ago. His global media empire began in the 1950s, including The Sun, The Wall Street Journal and Fox News. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts. Just scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.